Okay, so Tony, could you please tell us about yourself, what your background is, and what the job is that you do now?
So I'm currently Vice President Supply Chain at Teva Canada. Teva Canada is a company that produces generic medication. We're pretty large. We're number one in the world, number one in the U.S., number one in Canada. I work in the Canadian operation, which has about 1,500 employees between Toronto and Mirabel, which is a place north of Montreal. I'm from education. I'm a civil engineer. I have a fairly diverse career. I worked many years in. I worked a few years in construction management. I worked many years in IT consulting, and through that, I spent about 10, 15 years in consulting in the financial services industry. So my background is a lot on business process engineering. And through that, I got involved into the paper industry and then in the pharmaceutical industry, where I did some work in processes and systems for supply chain management. Then through that, I became VP of supply chain. So I've been running the supply chain of first of Racipharm and then Teva. Teva acquired Racipharm. So I've been running the supply chain or a supply chain in this industry since 2005. So I've got about 7 years of doing what I'm doing now.
Thank you. And so you begin there to describe your own supply chain. Could you expand on that and describe what you're involved with now?
So the Teva Canada supply chain is actually quite complex. Teva Global has over 40 plants around the world that make medication. Teva Canada has 2 plants in the Toronto area and 1 in Mirabel. About close to 50% of the volume that we deliver to the Canadian market is made in Canada, and the other half is made outside of Canada. Half of that is made by other Teva plants, primarily in Israel and Hungary, and then the other part comes from third parties, so other pharmaceutical companies, whether they are innovators or generic companies. So basically, we have products coming into Canada from a multitude of plants that make finished goods. Those products made in those plants use raw materials that come from all over the world, but the primary sources of raw material are India, and to a lesser extent China, and then there's a bit of everything in Europe and South America. So it's geographically very spread out supply chain. Now the role of a supply chain group, at least in this organization, my group, what we do is we essentially monitor demand in the market. We work with colleagues in marketing and sales to look at projections of demand, and then we plan what the various stages of the supply chain need to do to deliver product when it's needed. So that means that we have to plan what raw material manufacturers make in order to then supply plants that consume those materials to create finished goods, and make sure those finished goods get released on time from when they're needed in the market. It's a pretty challenging situation because we're talking about a supply chain which typically lasts 4 to 6 months. So it takes 4 to 6 months from the point where we place the order for raw materials to the point where the finished goods are released for sale in the warehouse. It's a pretty slow supply chain. It's not an easy supply chain to change. So not only it involves many parts all over the world, but it's pretty long. And what that does is that when there are changes in the marketplace, and these days we were talking about shortages the other day, so the situation with shortages in the market introduce a lot of variability in demand. And that variability in demand is not easy to handle when you're working with a 6-month supply chain because you can't react fast enough. So if there's a hole in the market, because, for instance, another company has stocked out a particular product, and we have to go fill that hole. The requirement is now, but there's 6 months to go, 4 to 6 months to go before you can create new product. So it's not an easy supply chain to work with.
I'm sure. Can you maybe talk more broadly about the major trends that you see in supply chain management today? What do you think are the main things that supply chain people are talking about today?
I think that there's 2 or 3 themes that are surfacing or are going to surface as primary concerns to practitioners. The first is that what I described in my industry as a long supply chain is not unique to my industry. And the situation in the market where demand is highly variable that is occurring in my market is not unique to this market either. So what has to occur is that the 4 to 6 months that take to produce a new product has to shrink dramatically. And so this is one big thing. In order for these long cycles to shrink, the main strategy to shrink long cycles is to shrink the time it takes to go from one company to the other. So the supply chain I described to you could start, for instance, in raw material manufacturer, then those raw materials have to go into a finished goods manufacturer. There could be 2 manufacturers, one that produces the tablets in bulk, and then another that puts the tablets into bottles. We call that packaging. So you could have a raw materials plant, you can then have a manufacturing plant and a packaging plant. The time it takes for the process to go from one plant to the other today is very long. You could slice the total cycle of the chain in half just by working on that time, as opposed to working on the time it takes to get things done inside each plant. So that's one theme. So the theme is to try to turn a supply chain made of many companies where the process is fragmented. So it goes and then it stops. And then it starts again in another company, and then it stops. And it starts again in another company, and then it stops. So go from a process like that to a process that doesn't stop. That's how you can collapse. And that calls to integration of the supply chain and integration of what's called the extra enterprise, as opposed to just each individual company, everything working as one company. So that's one theme. Another thing that I've been working a lot on is that most people that work in supply chain or that call themselves as being in supply chain, they typically come from 2 backgrounds. They're either people that work inside plants or they're people that work for distributors. The people that work for distributors, their notion of supply chain and their familiarity with supply chain is in the logistical space more than anything else. So they know about trucks and about space and about warehouses and so on. So so you talk to people from Rona or from Home Depot, you're going to get that kind of language. If you talk to people that come from Farm Science or Teva or other manufacturers, they'll talk about planning what happens inside the plant. Now, what happens inside the plant, we refer to it as operational planning and not supply chain management. What happens with distributors, it's either logistical management or it's distribution planning. But neither one is really supply chain management. The notion that's emerging, and I've done a lot of work with that, is that supply chain management is not concerned with any operation. Supply chain management is concerned with the synchronization of all the players from beginning to end of a supply flow. So if you look at what the first company and the second and the third and the fourth have to do, the role of supply chain management is making sure that they're all doing things in sync, and in sync with a particular behavior of demand. So supply chain management moves from being people that work in operations to people that work with demand and the behavior of demand in the market, and then align the chain with that demand, as opposed to working from inside a particular organization, be it a distributor or be it a manufacturer. So this is another theme, which is the separation of the classical field of operations research and operational planning and management, separating from that its own space of managing the supply chain as such. This is it's something that sometimes gets an expression in the emergence of 4PLs and 5PLs as opposed to the traditional 3PLs, for example. So a company like UPS has been for a few years now offering a 4PL service where they're basically synchronizing many different companies in a complex supply chain, but they don't necessarily use their own warehouses and their own trucks. They use those of a 3PL. Okay, so this is a theme that that the practice, I think, is evolving into, is a view of supply chain management more external. And if you put the two together, it's only by looking at the supply chain externally that you can really focus in removing the space between the companies in the chain. And removing the space between the companies in the chain, that takes us into social media, because it is largely accomplished by connecting people with people and not by connecting systems with systems, which is an old view of e-commerce and so on, and B2B and so on and so forth. The connection of organizations and creating fluidity as the flow passes from company to company has to be accomplished by connecting people with people, not systems to systems. In fact, I've done many studies that show me that, and even my own experiments, that you can create the connectivity through the chain without working in systems at all, just by working with people, connecting to people. So those, I think, are the big themes of supply chain management. If I jump into the social media angle, a distinction to be made is that a lot of work in supply chain management has been done through projects in large enterprises to implement ERP systems. And so through the 1990s and the 2000s, there's been a lot of knowledge developed and practice developed in structuring processes. ERP systems, advanced planning systems, and business systems in general are very good to support structured processes. But structured processes are good only for part of life. And that's the part of life where things happen as they're supposed to happen. But there's this other part of life where things happen as they're not supposed to happen. With all the changes that are occurring in the economy, in our society, and in the various industries, the latter is becoming a majority relative to the former. So more and more people in the workplace find themselves faced with situations that should not have happened. And unfortunately, structured processes aren't very good at anticipating what shouldn't happen. By design, a structured process speaks about what should happen. So what I have found is that structured processes and ERP systems and other business systems, they are very good at getting the enterprise organized for the predictable part of life. But what do you do with the things that aren't supposed to happen? When things that aren't supposed to happen occur, the best device to respond to a situation is the improvisation that human beings are capable of doing. And that's where I sometimes talk about spontaneous association, which is a term that I first came across in a book by Dan Tapscott and Anthony Williams of Economics. So what spontaneous association is a reflex that human beings have, that if they are aware of each other's skills, they can construct a solution to a problem through pure improvisation. And this is something we're capable of doing very quickly, better than a computer can do, or certainly a process or a business system could do. So the metaphor that I work with is in those things which are surprises, things you need to react quickly to, and so on, spontaneous association is the best mechanism to deal with it. And then for other things, which is the business as usual, the normal things, the core of what an enterprise can do, that's where structured processes play their role. And it's the two combined that can enable an enterprise that's ready for today. Because today there's a lot of change, a lot of surprises. You have to have a strong component that can respond to surprises.
So presumably this is what you mean when you talk about traditional command and control structures being outdated.
Yes, because what happens, so a traditional command and control structure is that of a vertically integrated corporation. You know, the pyramid, it was invented, or it wasn't invented, but it became important and grew from about the 1920s, where the large capital corporations were required to invest in and to fuel the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of capital was needed, so the only way to mobilize all of that is to put everything in one place. So you had the big companies like General Motors and AT&T and stuff that came about. But for most of the 20th century, the economy was largely controlled by producers. And producers tend to make things predictable. And so mass production had a place to be. Today, we're going in the opposite direction of the customer economy and of the not specialized, but personalized economy, where things aren't done in large quantities the same for everybody. It's the opposite. And there's so much change going on. There's change going on in technology. There's change going on in a bunch of new fields coming about, like nanotechnology, biotechnology, all the rest of that. There's change brought about by the internet, by the information revolution, all the rest of that, that the world is turning itself around over and over again. So anybody working on any enterprise is constantly facing change. And when you face change, you have to react very quickly. So an organization that is structured on the premise that everything is stable is going to fail. And the traditional vertical organization is a model that's based on the premise that everything is predictable and stable, as it was in 1920 or in 1960. Yeah. So what happens today is many or most old companies accept that paradigm. So you come work into a company, and there are discussions about organization structures, and what do you hear? You hear about levels, and you hear about functional groups. So the organization with functional groups is an organization that is not able to react quickly to what it had not predicted. So that's what I mean by an organization that is outdated. The functional group and the benefits of the functional group are an idea that responded to circumstances that were present over 100 years ago and are now no longer present. It's a completely different reality. I favor the abandonment of the functional structure. I even favor the abandonment of the hierarchical structure altogether, to adopt new paradigms of how to organize people, which are emerging. And the paradigm I favor that's emerging is the paradigm of the network. And I don't mean network of computers, I mean network of people. So where in my blog I talked about a model where you have cells of multi-skilled individuals that are networked amongst themselves. So if you now think in terms of social media, if you think about the behaviors you witness in large groups in Facebook, for instance, the typical adolescent is going to have 400 or 500 friends. So you got cells, clusters of many individuals with no particular structure, getting a lot of things done and a lot of traffic moving. So in a corporation, you can adopt that model, where basically what you're doing is you're liberating the skills of the organization into an environment that's not highly structured, and therefore it liberates them to respond to situations spontaneously. That's the new organization that I think has to evolve.
Okay, and at the same time as being critical, perhaps, of traditional structures, you say that organizations should be process-driven. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's very rare in the evolution of knowledge in our society, in our history. It's very rare that a philosophy that becomes outdated becomes completely irrelevant. There's always a place for it. And so business processes and the structure of business processes have a place and an important place. So if you describe what a enterprise intends to do, if you describe it in business processes, what you achieve is a picture of the core practices of what that company is supposed to do. So if you're making medication, you can't improvise every day how to make medication. You'll be completely first of all, it will not be allowed, but even if it were, it would be very inefficient. So a structure, a very elegant architecture of business processes describing the 2 or 3 fundamental practices of the enterprise, what they do is they provide a common reference to everybody working in the company. And what that does, then it creates coherence. So when individuals are spontaneously reacting to events, they're doing it in a coherent fashion. So they're not going across purposes, they're not doing things that don't make any sense. And the outside world of customers isn't getting this disparate, varied, unpredictable experience. You're getting a predictable, consistent experience. Because in the end, an enterprise, no matter how it's formatted, whether it's the model of a social entrepreneur or whether it's the model of a specialized manufacturer, it always has a value proposition to the market. That value proposition has to be coherent. You can't be, we each are doing whatever we want. So where does that coherence come from? It comes from a nice architecture of processes that describes the fundamentals of how things are supposed to be done. If you're making medication, you make it this way. If you are helping a customer understanding how to use medication, these are the things you need to know, these are the things the customer is going to ask you, these are the things you need to be able to explain. That also entails what are the necessary skills to carry out that promise. So you may need pharmacists, and you may need mathematicians, and you may need people with expertise in commerce and supply chain management, in manufacturing, industrial engineers, and so on. How do you decide what are the skills you need? You have to have a prescribed view of how to carry out this mission. But that's just a point of reference so that when we are spontaneously reacting and improvising and how to handle issues, the choices we make are all coherent because they follow a stable, predictable, predefined set of guidelines. The danger, though, is that you have to be careful not moving from a process structure to a procedural structure. And without getting into specifics, which would take too long, you have to focus on defining what needs to be done, not too much how it should be done. Yeah? So an elegant process structure defines what needs to be done. And it's laced with rules that impose constraints. So for instance, you cannot, in our industry, we cannot change the way we make a product, we cannot change the formulation of a product without going through a number of steps that seek authorization from Health Canada, that we change the formulation, and we demonstrate that it's still doing the job. It's still the same medication it was before, we're just doing it in a slightly different way. So you can't just back it whatever way you want. You have to obey certain rules. So a process structure gives you a practice structure. It gives you the rules of the game, the constraints, the laws, the things you cannot offend. And then within that framework, now you can let individuals go loose and react to situations. So that's how I see the metaphor of combining an architecture of processes with the freedom of individuals to spontaneously react to situations.
Okay, and then to take that into the use of social media, you argue, I think, that that social media has a big role to play in making a system like this work.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. If so let's say you have 12 individuals of different skills, and you've structured your enterprise so that you have the 12 skills needed to handle a range of challenges, a range of situations. They're all there. Now you want them to spontaneously react to that, spontaneously combine their skills to resolve problems. Well, where do they do it? So one approach is you can put them all in the same room. So you can just say, well, we'll have, our office is going to be redesigned, and it's going to have 20 conference rooms, and each one of them is going to have 12 people. They're permanently sitting there so that they can permanently react to situations. You're limited to how many people you put in a room. The only way that people in a room can work together is if they're all there at the same time. So what happens if suddenly there's a problem that requires somebody from the other room? The person is in the other room. So the problem with physical reality and people sitting in a physical conference room is that they're all needed at the same time in that place. So that's the limitation of the physical world. So you can do it that way, but you will have these limitations. Social media moves the conferencing of individuals into cyberspace. And in cyberspace, we don't have the same laws. So in cyberspace, people can be in many places at the same time because they're all virtual places. So I could actually be in 3 different discussions at the same time. And a discussion, a problem, can be discussed over a period of time without everybody being present at the same time, which is the difference with a meeting. If you call a meeting, why are you calling a meeting? Because you need everybody at the same time to discuss the issue. Very inefficient. But if you go into a virtual space, and if you use the discussion metaphor of social media that you find in Facebook and to some extent in Twitter, essentially you are basically allowing people to be in many issues at the same time and not everybody on the issue at the same time. And so individuals contribute to resolving problems when they are available and in no particular sequence, but they're not limited by space or by time. They just basically work on everything at the same time. So that to me is why social media and social media tools, virtual collaboration tools, are a great technology to have around. Maybe one day there'll be a better one, but right now I don't know anything better that allows people to collaborate in a very dynamic fashion and very quickly and not holding up the resolution of problems, as is the case if you're following the Outlook calendar and booking everybody into meetings in conference rooms for a point in time.
How do you think social media will impact the supply chain in terms of how will the supply chain operate differently because of the use of social media in the future? Do you think there's an impact there that it might have?
Yes. So I said earlier that our supply chain lasts 4 to 6 months. And I've also said that most of that time is silent time between companies, so nothing's really happening. So if I'm a producer of finished goods and I need raw materials for 2 months from now, so I make a plan and I decide at 3 o'clock in the afternoon that I need these materials. What's going to happen next is that somebody is going to take that information and probably place it in a series of purchase orders and send it over to the supplier. The supplier may get that in a few days, and then the supplier is probably working on monthly cycles. So if I'm also working on monthly cycles, as most companies are, I'll probably send this information towards the 3rd week of the month. The supplier receives it on the 3rd week of the month. Their next cycle is next month. So they will not touch this information until next month. And then next month, they finally touch the information. They'll spend the month planning when to do that, which will not be before the following month. So just without doing anything, between the point that I said I need this material until the point where the supplier actually does something about it, 2 months have gone. So that's what I mean by there's a lot of waste space there. So what should really happen is that the minute that I see that I need more material, the supplier should be there with me, seeing that I need more material, and immediately planning how to get more material. And so I could go from 2 months to 2 hours. How do you do this? Well, you do this by bringing together people from all of these companies into a virtual space where they are not bounded or limited or constrained by the fact that they are in different companies and or in different cities and or in different buildings. And they basically face the challenge all at the same time. If there's a shortage in the market, a particular product, and we as a company could respond to that, what would happen is the pharmacist raises the requirement, the wholesaler finds the requirement, and the manufacturer finds the requirement, and the raw material supplier finds the requirement, everybody at the same time. And so all of us can sit around that virtual table and decide how is it that we're going to do all of our parts so that there'll be new medication in the market in, for instance, 2 weeks. Whereas today you'll take 3 to 6 months before that situation is resolved. That's how I think that social media can help, is by networking people across multiple enterprises. But inside the enterprise, a large company like ours has 1,500 people, and it's a functional structure. Anything that needs to be done by this company involves multiple functional groups. There's nothing significant that we do that is done by one group. and there's nothing that one group does that is significant. So everything this company does has to go through various groups. Well, we have the same problem, that to go from one group to the other it takes a long time. But if we apply social media, now everybody can see the problem at the same time, things can move faster. So where I think that social media can play an enormous role is in increasing the speed of operations inside enterprises and supply chains across enterprises. This is where it's going to make all the difference.
And as these changes happen, is this going to impact the type of work that people do in the supply chain and the jobs that they do? What's the experience going to be like for the people who are doing the day-to-day supply chain jobs?
It depends on how far down the road we look at. But first of all, what is happening? What has been happening in the past 10 years, and especially in the past 5 years, is that people, the younger people from Generation X and especially Generation Y, have been coming in large numbers into the workforce, and today either equal or outnumber baby boomers. So what is happening in the enterprises of this country and other countries is a conflict, a Cold War, if you like, between the views and the paradigms of the younger generations that grew up in the past 20 years, people that basically are now entering the workforce or have entered the workforce in the past 5 to 7 years. So they come into it learning how to work or wanting to work in a social media world. That is in conflict with the management structures, people my age or older, who grew up and learned how to do business in the 1980s, in the days of time management and the time management portfolio and the little agendas and the minutes and all the rest of that, right? So you got these two forces colliding with each other silently, but definitely colliding. And I think what will happen, just as it happened from the 70s to the 80s, what will happen now is this younger workforce with completely different habits is going to overpower the management structures and change the way organizations work and behave, to go into multitasking and to go into what I call now mode. So we have a problem now, we fix it now. With virtual collaboration and without social networking and with social networking, we can resolve things now, things that happen now. Whereas in the old world of let's call a meeting and let's manage the meeting with a structure where you have an agenda and then you have minutes and you have follow-ups, problems are just shuffled and moved to the next meeting and the next meeting and take forever. So those ways of working are going to die because there will be enough companies working in this other way that the old companies will either perish or change, but they cannot possibly survive. So I don't think this will affect only the supply chain, it'll affect everything. Now, in the supply chain of today, all supply chains, you just look at what's been happening with Apple in the past 3-4 years, the experience of the first iPad and the third iPad, and how the supply chain basically collapsed between the first and the second, and now everything is going smoothly, right? So speed is extremely important. If you want to dominate, speed is extremely important. The time it takes to do things is very important. This industry can't survive on 4 to 6 months supply chains. The government in the U.S. is putting a lot of pressure for the shortages to get resolved. The government is kind of starting to put pressure. Pharmacy Association is putting pressure. Something is going to give. Something has to react. And the something is going to be a very fast supply chain because there's no other way of reacting to unpredictable demand and to shortages. Those fast supply chains can only emerge through extra enterprise social networking. They can't emerge by connecting systems and by business processes and by EDI transactions and by all of these other notions that could have worked very well in 1995, but they have no hope in hell of working today. So what will change is that the people that are comfortable with this way of working are going to come in, change the enterprise, break the barriers, destroy the hierarchical structure, create a networked world that will network just as easily inside the enterprise as across to the next enterprise. That, I think, is the fundamental paradigm change that is brewing right now. And you fast forward 5 years and it'll be somewhere along those lines.
So you've said, Tony, that the discussion on the use of social media by organizations and in the supply chain should recognize that there have been problems as well as successes. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
There's always problems. Success comes from overcoming some of those problems, and they are limited. I think that every 2 to 3 years, the story will lean more towards the success than the problem. But the difficulty of introducing social media in an enterprise is the difficulty of introducing social networking between individuals working in an enterprise. That's really the problem. So organizations that are structured into functional groups will have a lot of difficulty adopting social networking, because the very structure that people work into are anti-social networking. The premise of social networking, as I see it, is the premise of spontaneous association, of people of multiple skills being allowed to combine their skills however they see fit to resolve problems. Otherwise, social networking becomes almost a moot point. I mean, if you put a bunch of functional groups communicating with each other through Facebook as opposed to email, and they continue to work as functional groups, it'll make no difference at all. It'll may become a moot point. Nobody will see the need to change. So there has to be a different way of working. Well, functional groups are against that way of working. In a functional group, here for instance, you have a functional group that only has chemists inside. And so what happened is the human behavior that evolves there is that if you are part of a 1,500 people group, and you are also part of a 30 people group where everybody's a chemist, very likely you're going to lean to spending most of your time in your 30 people group. You are unlikely to want to jump outside into a group of 1,500 people where you have no idea what people are doing, because you have no idea what people do in the other functional groups. So we are the greens, and we only understand what green does. Next door, there are these weird red guys. We have no idea what they're doing. So what are you going to do if I throw you into a pool that looks like a rainbow? You will have no idea what to do. So this is what we find. We find, especially in large groups, that people tend to entrench themselves into their functional groups. Because they entrench themselves into the functional groups, they are anti-networking. So they're not really conditioned to work with people of other skills, everybody at the same time. They are conditioned to spend their time in their unicolor world, and from time to time go into this conference room where it looks more like a rainbow for about an hour, and they're discussing something with other people, and then they go back to the security of everybody is the same. So functional organizations, just by the human behavior that they foster, are anti-social network. Now, these functional boxes have bosses. And 3 or 4 functional boxes have another boss on top. Bosses tend to have egos, and they tend to like the power they have over everything that's going on in that little group. So managers, directors, and vice presidents are themselves against social networking, because they are, especially in so-called command and control structures, they are more comfortable with deciding what people do and even how people do it. Social networking goes against that. Social networking is, no, you no longer decide what people do. You just decide maybe who does things, because you'll say the engineers do this and the chemists do that. You will not mix them up, and you will make that very clear. But in social networking, what you want is you want people to be in front of each other and working very, very fast. They can't wait for the boss to tell them what to do. They can't wait for 4 or 5 bosses to tell them what to do, you see? So the whole paradigm and behavior that's inherent into a functional organization structure runs directly against the way of working in social networking. This is the big resistance factor. So it's very hard to go into any organization over 300 people and to penetrate social networking. It does not happen naturally. It will happen naturally, though, when the younger people become more and more numerous, and they start taking over the manager jobs, and they start changing the game.
Thanks, Tony. And the final question that I've got for you is really about advice for the people who will be watching this video. Many of them will already be working. Some of them will be entering the workforce in the not too distant future. What advice would you have for them for their careers in this new world that they're going to move into? What do you think is the best advice to give them about that'll help them as they move forward?
Well, so a few suggestions. If you're entering the workforce, you're probably in your early 20s. If you went back to school, then you're back into the early and you're into the workforce, you're probably under the age of 35. So you're still very young. And because you're very young, if I tell you that things are going to become very nice for you over the next 5 to 10 years, that's not a long period of time because you're still in the beginning. If you grew up with social networking and you're comfortable with social networking, if you go into an organization that's empty, don't get discouraged because the numbers are on your side and time is on your side. It's a matter of time before the world becomes a social networked world across the enterprise. In the year 2000, many companies did not have a website and many individuals did not have a web address. Within an email address. Within 2 or 3 years, you couldn't do business unless you had a website and you had an email address. And another 2 years, nobody cared about your phone number. What then you wanted to know, nobody cared about your address. Everybody wanted to know your email address. So the world changed. A few years ago, I told some friends of mine in the company I was working that you need to have a Facebook page, and everybody laughed. Today, all businesses that call themselves businesses have Facebook pages. So the world is changing. It's a matter of time. So if you go into an organization, you like the job, you like the trade, you like the subject matter, but the organization is arthritic, look for 2 things. Does it look like things are changing? If they are, stick around and be part of that process and push change. If you see that things are not changing, run like hell and go find a place where things are changing or have changed. But do not stay in an organization that smells and looks like a dinosaur and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. It's arthritic, it's not changing, the bosses all look the same, they all talk the same language, they all go into meetings, they have minutes and agendas and so on. If you see a lot of meetings booked to a calendar with an agenda, with minutes and with follow-up action lists, run like hell, unless you're lucky enough to find a boss that's running things in a different way, and it looks like that boss is being accepted, and that environment is being accepted, then there's hope that things will evolve into the world of tomorrow. Because the world of tomorrow is coming. Just make sure you are in it when it comes, as opposed to being on the side of the economy that's dying.
Tony, thanks very much for doing this today.